He wanted to build the tallest buildings on Earth. He succeeded. And then he spent the rest of his life watching them become the most controversial, the most hated, and ultimately the most mourned structures in American history. David Rockefeller didn't just construct two towers. He constructed a symbol so powerful it would outlive the buildings themselves, seared into human memory forever. Hey everyone, Ashton here. Welcome back. This channel is still growing, and every subscribe helps me bring you more stories like this one. If forgotten history and buried secrets are your thing, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe and stick around. Today we're walking through the complete story of the World Trade Center, from a billionaire's napkin sketch to smoldering wreckage, and I promise you, what I found while researching this changed how I understand ambition itself. But to grasp how two towers became a funeral pyre for the American century, we need to travel back to a winter afternoon in 1946, when a young banker stared out his office window at a crumbling waterfront and saw something nobody else could see. David Rockefeller was not supposed to be the visionary. That role belonged to his older brother Nelson, the politician, the governor, the man everyone assumed would become president. David was the quiet one, the banker, the grandson content to manage the family fortune rather than expand it. But standing at that window in the Chase Manhattan Bank headquarters, watching ferries cross the Hudson toward a waterfront choked with aging piers and obsolete warehouses, something shifted in him. Lower Manhattan was dying. The great financial institutions that had defined American power for a century were fleeing north, abandoning the narrow streets and cramped offices for the wide avenues of Midtown. Department stores were closing. Restaurants were shuttering. The streets that once thundered with commerce now echoed with emptiness after 5 in the evening. David Rockefeller saw a corpse, but he also saw resurrection. What if, he wondered, you could build something so massive, so audacious, so utterly impossible to ignore that it would reverse the tide entirely? What if you could construct a gravitational center so powerful that business would have no choice but to flow back downtown? What if you could build the future itself? The idea consumed him. Through the 1950s, while his brother Nelson climbed the political ladder, David quietly assembled allies, cultivated politicians, and sketched visions on restaurant napkins that his dinner companions found either inspiring or insane. He needed the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a quasi-governmental agency with the power to issue bonds and condemn property. He needed the governors of both states. He needed the mayor. He needed, in essence, to convince an entire region that his fever dream deserved to become reality. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Because the site David Rockefeller selected for his towers wasn't empty land waiting to be developed. It was a neighborhood, a living, breathing, thriving neighborhood called Radio Row. Picture 16 square blocks of electronics shops, radio repair stores, surplus dealers, and small businesses that had grown organically over half a century. 13,000 people worked there. Hundreds of family businesses, some spanning 3 generations, crowded storefronts where customers could find vacuum tubes, transistors, speakers, and every component needed to build or repair the devices that connected America to the world. The sidewalks overflowed with merchandise. Vendors shouted prices. Immigrants who had arrived with nothing had built something meaningful here, block by block, year by year. David Rockefeller looked at Radio Row and saw blight. The merchants looked at their life's work and saw home. The condemnation notices arrived in 1962. The Port Authority, armed with eminent domain powers that Rockefeller had helped secure, informed hundreds of business owners that their properties would be seized, their leases terminated, their futures demolished to make way for progress. The compensation offered was insultingly inadequate. Many merchants had invested everything they had into their shops. Now they were being told to disappear. They fought back. A merchant named Oscar Nadell became the face of resistance, organizing protests, filing lawsuits, and demanding that someone, anyone, explain why his livelihood mattered less than a banker's vanity project. The legal battles dragged on for years. Protesters carried signs through the streets. Newspapers ran sympathetic stories about small businessmen crushed by big money. None of it mattered. The Port Authority's powers were virtually unlimited. The courts sided with progress. One by one, the shops went dark. The owners accepted their inadequate checks and scattered to the winds, their community erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Oscar Nadell was the last to leave. He reportedly stood in his empty storefront, surrounded by bare shelves and disconnected wires, and wept. Where 13,000 people once earned their living, construction crews now prepared to dig the largest foundation hole in human history. The engineering challenges alone seemed designed to humble any architect foolish enough to attempt them. The site sat on Manhattan's western edge, where bedrock plunged 70 feet below the surface, buried under ancient river silt and centuries of landfill. To build foundations strong enough to support the tallest buildings ever attempted, workers would need to excavate to bedrock while somehow preventing the Hudson River from flooding the pit. The solution was a technique called the slurry wall method, never before attempted at this scale. Engineers would dig narrow trenches around the entire perimeter, filling them with a dense liquid mixture of water and benite clay that would prevent the walls from collapsing. Then they would lower steel reinforcing cages into the slurry and pump concrete from the bottom up, displacing the liquid and creating a waterproof barrier strong enough to hold back the river. It worked. Somehow, impossibly, it worked. The bathtub, as workers called it, held firm while excavators removed over 1 million cubic yards of earth and debris. That material, rather than being hauled away, was dumped along the Hudson shoreline, creating 92 acres of new land that would eventually become Battery Park City. The towers were literally reshaping Manhattan's geography before a single steel beam had been erected. But the engineering triumph masked a growing financial nightmare. The projected cost of $575 million had been optimistic even by 1960s standards. By the time construction began in earnest, the real figure was climbing toward $1.5 billion, making the World Trade Center the most expensive construction project in American history. And the Port Authority, despite David Rockefeller's promises, was struggling to find tenants willing to lease space in buildings that didn't yet exist. The architectural design itself sparked controversy. Minoru Yamasaki, the architect selected to give form to Rockefeller's vision, had created something genuinely original. Rather than the glass curtain walls that had defined post-war skyscrapers, Yamasaki designed facades of narrow aluminum columns separated by mere 22 inches of glass. The effect was striking, almost Gothic, the towers appearing less as modern buildings than as abstract sculptures stretched impossibly toward the sky. Critics were merciless. The prominent architect Ada Louise Huxtable called the designs boring, banal, and an embarrassment. Others complained that the narrow windows created claustrophobic offices where workers couldn't see the views they were supposedly paying premium rents to enjoy. The towers were called filing cabinets, packaging crates, monuments to ego rather than architecture. Yamasaki, a gentle man who privately suffered from anxiety so severe he couldn't ride elevators in tall buildings, absorbed the criticism quietly. He had designed his towers to evoke the vertical thrust of Gothic cathedrals, to make observers feel small in the presence of something reaching toward heaven. That the critics saw only banality hurt him deeply. The first tower topped out in December 1970, the second in July 1971. For a brief moment, the World Trade Center claimed the title of world's tallest buildings, surpassing the Empire State Building that had held that record for 40 years. But the victory was fleeting. Within 2 years, the Sears Tower in Chicago would steal the crown, rendering Rockefeller's monuments merely the second tallest, a silver medal in a competition that had cost billions of dollars and erased an entire neighborhood. And still, the tower stood largely empty. The recession of the early 1970s had devastated New York's economy. Businesses were fleeing the city entirely, not relocating to different neighborhoods. The Port Authority, desperate to fill the void, became its own largest tenant, moving thousands of government workers into offices that private companies refused to lease. New York State followed suit, occupying floor after floor that should have housed banks and trading firms and multinational corporations. The towers had been built to revive Lower Manhattan. Instead, they had become the most expensive public housing in American history, subsidized by taxpayers who had never been asked whether they wanted to fund David Rockefeller's dream. But here's where the story begins its strange transformation. Because something unexpected happened as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s. The towers, despite all predictions, despite all criticism, despite all financial logic, began to succeed. Partly, it was simple familiarity. New Yorkers who had initially dismissed the buildings as eyesores gradually found themselves using them as landmarks, their distinctive silhouette becoming as recognizable as the Statue of Liberty or the Brooklyn Bridge. Partly it was the observation deck, which drew millions of tourists eager to stand atop the tallest buildings in New York and gaze out at a world that seemed impossibly small from 110 stories up. And partly, it was the financial industry itself, which finally discovered that the tower's massive floor plates were perfectly suited for the trading operations that would soon transform Wall Street. By the 1990s, the World Trade Center had become what David Rockefeller always claimed it could be, the symbolic heart of global capitalism. The towers housed tenants from over 24 countries. The trading floors of Cantor Fitzgerald and Morgan Stanley hummed with billions of dollars of daily transactions. The underground mall, connected to subway lines and PATH trains, served 50,000 daily commuters. The complex that critics had called a white elephant had become the most successful commercial development in New York history. David Rockefeller, now in his 80s, could look at his creation with something approaching satisfaction. He had outlived most of his critics. He had seen his impossible dream become an indispensable landmark. He had reshaped a city, a skyline, and an economy. He could not see what was coming. None of them could. The first warning came on February 26, 1993. A rental truck packed with 1,300 pounds of explosives detonated in the underground parking garage, ripping a crater 6 stories deep and killing 6 people. The blast had been intended to topple one tower into the other, a catastrophic collapse that would have killed tens of thousands. The terrorists had miscalculated. The explosion, though devastating, failed to compromise the structural integrity that Yamasaki had engineered into his design. But the attack exposed a vulnerability that would prove fatal. The towers, for all their engineering sophistication, had been designed in an era when terrorism meant hijackings and ransom demands, not suicide attacks intended to maximize casualties. The evacuation on that February day was chaotic, terrifying, and revelatory. It took hours for 50,000 workers to descend smoke-filled stairwells on foot. The emergency systems that should have provided guidance and communication failed repeatedly. The buildings survived, but the experience haunted those who lived through it. In the years that followed, security improved. Concrete barriers prevented vehicles from approaching the towers. Identification checks screened visitors. The parking garage where the bomb had detonated was redesigned and reinforced. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. The towers were symbols, and symbols attract those who wish to destroy what they represent. The morning of September 11, 2001, began like countless mornings before it. Commuters emerged from subway stations into brilliant late summer sunshine. Office workers carried coffee cups and newspapers into lobbies that gleamed with polished marble. Traders settled into their desks, screens flickering with the opening movements of global markets. Tourists queued for the observation deck, cameras ready to capture the views they had traveled thousands of miles to see. At 8:46 in the morning, everything changed forever. What happened in the next 102 minutes has been documented, analyzed, memorialized, and debated more thoroughly than perhaps any other event in modern history. I will not dwell on the details of that morning. They belong to the families who lost loved ones, to the survivors who carry memories no one should have to bear, to a nation that watched in real time as the impossible became undeniable. What I will say is this. In his final years, David Rockefeller rarely spoke publicly about September 11th. The man who had spent decades defending his creation, who had fought critics and skeptics and protesters with the absolute conviction of someone who knew he was right, found himself unable to process what had happened. The towers he had willed into existence against all opposition had become the instruments of the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. The symbols of American financial supremacy had been transformed into symbols of American vulnerability. He donated millions to memorial funds. He attended ceremonies and groundbreakings. He lived long enough to see the new One World Trade Center rise from the wreckage, a single tower designed to be both monument and statement. He died in March 2017 at the age of 101, the last surviving grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the end of a dynasty that had shaped American life for over a century. But the question that haunted him, the question that haunts this story still, is one that has no comfortable answer. Was it worth it? The 13,000 workers of Radio Row lost their livelihoods so that David Rockefeller could build his monuments. Their community was erased, their protests ignored, their suffering deemed acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of progress. They received no memorials, no observances, no moment of national silence. They simply disappeared, replaced by towers that themselves would disappear, leaving behind only memories and absence and a void in the skyline that will never truly be filled. 2,977 people died on September 11th. First responders who rushed into burning buildings never emerged. Office workers who arrived early found themselves trapped above fires they couldn't escape. Passengers on 4 hijacked aircraft faced choices no human being should ever have to make. Their names are inscribed in bronze around 2 vast reflecting pools that now occupy the footprint where the towers once stood, water cascading endlessly into voids that can never be filled. David Rockefeller built his empire. He achieved everything he set out to achieve. He revitalized Lower Manhattan, created an iconic skyline, and proved that sheer force of will can reshape the physical world. He also enabled the destruction of a neighborhood, the deaths of thousands, and the creation of a wound in the American psyche that still bleeds today. Perhaps that's what empire always costs. Perhaps that's what ambition always demands. Perhaps the lesson of the Twin Towers is simply that human beings will always reach for the sky, will always build monuments to their own greatness, will always sacrifice the small and the vulnerable in pursuit of the grand and the eternal. And perhaps the sky will always find a way to reach back. Today, if you visit the Memorial Plaza, you can stand where the towers stood and hear nothing but the rush of water and the murmur of visitors reading names they never knew. The new tower rises behind you, 104 stories of glass and steel designed to reclaim what was lost. Tour guides explain the history. School groups pose for photographs. Tourists from around the world come to pay respects to events they experienced only through television screens. But if you look carefully, if you know where to search, you can still find traces of what existed before even the Twin Towers rose. There are photographs and archives showing the bustling streets of Radio Row, the crowded storefronts, the merchants who built lives out of vacuum tubes and transistors. There are court records documenting their futile fight against condemnation. There are obituaries of men like Oscar Nadell, who never recovered from watching his life's work demolished. They built something too, something smaller, something humbler, something that didn't reshape skylines or attract tourists or earn entries in architecture textbooks. They built a community, a livelihood, a home, and it was taken from them so that David Rockefeller could build his empire. That empire is gone now. The buildings fell. The man died. The dynasty ended. But the story remains, a reminder that every monument rises on a foundation of loss, that every triumph casts a shadow of tragedy, that the tallest towers contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. This is what ambition costs. This is what empire demands. This is the dark legacy that David Rockefeller left behind, written not in stone or steel, but in the names of the erased and the fallen, echoing forever in the space where 2 towers once stood. And if you stand there long enough, in the place where Radio Row once thrived and the Twin Towers once soared, you might feel it. Not quite a presence, not quite a haunting, but something. A weight. A memory. The accumulated grief of a century of ambition and loss, settling like dust on your shoulders, asking questions that have no comfortable answers. Was it worth it? The water keeps falling. The names keep gleaming. The tourists keep coming. And the void remains, as vast and silent and permanent as anything David Rockefeller ever built.